Good evening. It's so good to be back with you, my holy sisters and brothers. That was Eitan Katz singing Ein Kelokenu. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we get together on a Thursday evening? Shabbos is coming. We've got so much material to cover tonight, so I'm going to read our little checklist as fast as I can. Sharon in New Jersey, James in Indianapolis, Randy in Florida, Pauline in Arkansas, Renee says welcome back from Indiana, Cheryl in Texas, Shandor in the Bronx, Christo in Lubbock, Paula in Chicago, Bill in mid-Missouri, Guy in Dayton, Ohio, Melissa in Great Neck, Paul in the Great Northwest, Heather says aloha from Hawaii. Welcome, Heather. Stephen in New Hampshire, Patrice in Utah, Gail in the Bay Area. Haven't missed a class yet, but first time live. Great to have you with us, Gail. Wait a minute. Scroll on. Don't scroll on me yet. Lucy in Minnesota, Nancy in North Carolina, Yosef in Lowell, Massachusetts. Heather loves the music. Lillian in New York and Talia in California. Over there on the YouTube side. Aoife in Florida. Marjorie in North Carolina. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Yitzi Sharf for the healing of Aliza, Talia, Sarah, Bas, Dina, Rachel. May she have a refuah shlema, a complete and speedy recovery. Yitzi, thank you so much for enabling us to share more Torah with more people. May you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings, and we say Amen. It was great to be away and to experience the simcha of a wedding. I shared a picture from my cousin Gary's daughter Hannah got married. Beautiful picture of when the father blessed the kala, blessed the bride. It was, just amazing. It was amazing to have the whole family together. These are difficult times, not so easy for weddings to come together. And it was just wonderful to be able to celebrate together. God willing, everybody's healthy and well and made it home safely like I did. So tonight we're getting back on track. We didn't want to miss any of the material in those dafs earlier here in Tractate Megillah that were just so rich, with stories and folktales and laws and deep meaning. Here in these last 5 pages, there's a little bit of some more technical matters. So, not such a bad area to speed through and do highlights of these last 5 pages so that we can get caught up as a group. But I certainly encourage everybody to read the whole page on your own, since I won't be able to cover the entirety of each page here tonight as we catch up. So we're picking it up on near the top of 20a. So here we are. We're in Tractate Megillah, the 11th volume of the Talmud. Tonight we're going to finish chapter 2 and open chapter 3. We're continuing our discussion of the third Mishna in chapter 2. Which is about the public reading of the Megillah, how it is accomplished, and this particular law that everyone is fit to read the Megillah, to do the public reading of the Megillah so that others can fulfill their obligation to hear the Megillah, the book of Esther, where Jews are obligated to hear the Megillah read out loud twice on Purim, the night of Purim, and the next day of Purim. Who can read the Megillah? Everybody except a deaf person, an imbecile, and a minor. Sometimes women are restricted from, sort of accomplishing certain things on behalf of the community, but not the Megillah. A woman can read the Megillah, although in Orthodox circles, usually that doesn't happen. However, a deaf person cannot. There's some discussion about that as we've already seen, but the idea that a deaf person can't, first of all, it has to be a person who's capable of speaking aloud to even have this issue come up. But because he or she can't hear the words themselves, they can't fulfill their obligation. If it's just somebody who's lost most of their hearing but has some hearing, then it's no problem. For sure, they're hearing the Megillah read and can read publicly to fulfill the obligation of others. We continue our discussion of this Mishnah at the top of page 20a. As it is taught in a Baraisa, So now that we're talking about speaking aloud and reading from scripture aloud, or praying aloud and praying in a community aloud. So as it was taught in a Baraisa, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, one who recites the Shema, so this is not a public reading on behalf of others, everyone is obligated to recite the Shema. Men morning and afternoon, women are encouraged to say the Shema twice a day also. And as we've discussed, women's obligations are a little bit different because they're not bound by time-bound positive mitzvahs. At any rate, this teaching is, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, one who recites the Shema must make it audible to his or her ears. As it is stated, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Deuteronomy 6:4. Now the word hear, Shema, indicating that you should allow your ears to hear the words you are expressing with your mouth. Rabbi Meir disagrees and says this is not necessary, as it is also stated there, and these words which I command you this day shall be in your heart. So is it enough to read the words and think them in your mind, or do you need to actually hear your mouth utter those words? Right, so Rabbi Yehuda is saying in the name of Elazar ben Azariah, yeah, you have to hear it. Rabbi Meir is the dissenting opinion on this, indicating that these words, the words of the Shema, go after the intent of the heart, as it is unnecessary to pronounce them out loud. We see that according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, as cited by Rabbi Yehuda, the words must be audible to one's ears. Skip one paragraph, and now it was taught in the Mishna that Rabbi Yehuda, right, we just had Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Now Rabbi Yehuda says that a minor is fit to read the Megillah. Is a minor obligated in the mitzvahs? No, you don't become obligated in the mitzvahs until you become a legal adult. But as we've seen, minors who are capable of understanding the mitzvahs should be encouraged to perform the mitzvahs so that they train themselves in the mitzvahs. So Rabbi Yehuda says that a minor is fit to read the Megillah, meaning if he's fit to learn how to read the Megillah and he can read the Megillah properly, can he read it out loud so that other people can fulfill their obligation to hear it? It is taught in a Baraisa. Rabbi Yehuda said, I can offer proof to my opinion, as when I was a minor, I myself read the Megillah before Rabbi Tarfon and the other elders in Lod, right? There's a big important community in Lod, and they in the Talmudic times, and they said to him in response, one cannot bring a proof from the testimony of a minor. Since at the time of the supposed incident, you were a minor, you are not qualified now to testify about it. Maybe it's true that, these sages allowed you to read it in front of the community as a minor, and therefore we should accept that the law is that a minor can read it. But since you were a minor at the time, we don't accept your testimony. If somebody else witnessed that who was an adult at the time and could tell us that the sages of Lod accepted that, then maybe we would take that argument into account. But not yours, since you were a minor at the time. And it was taught in a different Baraisa, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, right? So Rebbe, who edited the Mishna, said, when I was a minor, I read the Megillah before Rabbi Yehuda. And they said to him, well, one cannot bring a proof that an act is permitted from the behavior of the very one who permits it. Okay, he has the opinion that he permits it, but what about the other sages who disagree with him? So the fact that he permits it doesn't mean that it is generally permitted by agreement of the sages. So we know that Rabbi Yehuda maintains that a minor is fit to read the Megillah, since he remembers that he did it when he was a minor. But the fact that he acted in accordance with his own opinion does not prove that this is the accepted halacha, the accepted law. And the Gemara asks, and let them say to him, as the sages said to Rabbi Yehuda in the previous Baraisa, that one cannot bring a proof from the testimony of a minor. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, well, when I was a minor, I read it before Rabbi Yehuda. Why don't they say the same thing? Well, you were a minor. We don't accept your testimony. And the Gemara answers, they said one thing to him and then another, i.e. they rejected him with a twofold argument. One objection is that, yeah, you were a minor at the time, and so your testimony is disqualified. And furthermore, even if you had been an adult at that time and you witnessed a minor reading it before Rabbi Yehuda, that wouldn't prove anything, because we know that Rabbi Yehuda allows this. But what we're trying to ascertain is what the rest of the sages feel about this law. And that concludes the discussion of Mishnah number 3. Mishnah number 4. One may not read the Megillah, nor perform a circumcision, nor immerse himself in a mikveh, in a ritual bath, nor sprinkle the water purification to purify people and objects that had contracted tuma, ritual impurity through contact with a corpse, until after sunrise. All these activities have to be done during the day. When is day? After sunrise. There's a difference between daybreak and sunrise, meaning the first rays of light in the sky or the sun actually coming up over the horizon. So they're saying you can't do these activities until sunrise. And also, a woman who observes a clean day for each day that she experiences a discharge, i.e., a woman who experienced 1 or 2 days of non-menstrual bleeding, right, spotting not during the time of her period, and now she must wait until a day has passed without any discharge of blood before regaining ritual purity so that she and her husband are permitted to each other. She too may not immerse herself in the mikveh until the sun has risen. And with regard to all these activities that are supposed to be performed during the day, if one did them after daybreak, i.e., after the appearance of the first rays of light in the sky, which is before sunrise, they are valid, as at that point it is already considered daytime. So for all these activities which are supposed to be done during the day, you should do them after sunrise, ab initio. But if you did them just when there were the first rays of light in the sky, after the fact, it is valid because that also is considered day. That's the Mishnah. Gemara. The Gemara asks, from where do we derive the halakha, the law taught in the Mishnah, that the Megillah may be read only during the day? We've already established that the Megillah gets read at night. What's he saying? You can only read it during the day. Because when in the Hebrew calendar, every day begins the night before. So on Purim, we do a nighttime Megillah reading, and then the next day, during daytime, we do a daytime reading. There are 2 readings of the Megillah every Purim. What they're talking about here is not that the nighttime reading is somehow outlawed. Of course not. We do that reading at night. But vis-a-vis the daytime reading, it has to happen during the daytime. You can't do that nighttime reading and then, at 5 a.m. when it's almost day, do that daytime reading then. No, the daytime reading has to be done during the daytime. That's what they're saying. And so how do we know that? And the Gemara answers, as the verse states at Esther 9:28, and that these days should be remembered and kept. Esther 9:28. And the word days indicates that during the day, yes, but at night, no. And the Gemara asks, well, let us say that this is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. As Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, a person is obligated to read the Megillah at night and then repeat it during the day. And the Gemara rejects this. There is no proof from here, as when the Mishnah teaches that the Megillah may be read only during the day, it was referring to the daytime reading. But the nighttime reading is not considered here at all. We're not talking about the nighttime reading. We're just saying that there is also a daytime reading that must be done during the day. Okay, now we skip a bunch of paragraphs because we have to do that tonight. And we're on the B side of page 20. The Mishnah concludes, and with regard to all these activities that we read, that list, right, doing a circumcision, immersing in the bath, sprinkling the waters of purification, etc., and with regard to all these things, if one did them after daybreak, they are valid. You ought to wait until the sun has actually risen and it's fully day. But if you did it during that, sort of like the morning equivalent of twilight, right? when the sky starts to lighten, but the sun hasn't come up. If you did those, things that are required during the daytime, during that intermediate period, it is valid. And the Gemara asks, from where is this matter derived, that from daybreak it is already considered daytime? And Rava said, as the verse states, Genesis 1:5, and God called the light, and the word for that is or in Hebrew is light, and God called the light, the or, what did he call it? Day, right? He called it day. Where am I? Elohim. Yeah, exactly. Vayikra Elohim laor yom. Right? He called the light day. So God made this equivalent between or, light, and day, yom. And so therefore, if it's light, it's day. And to that which was becoming lighter and lighter, he called day. As soon as there was some light, is now that the Talmudic interpretation of that. Since he said the light is day, so as soon as there's some light and it's getting lighter and lighter, we call that day. The Hebrew word or is not to be understood in its usual sense of light, but as a verbal noun, that which is becoming lighter and lighter. Here it's like, or in this sense, in this context, doesn't just mean light, but it means brightening, like the light is growing. And it teaches that as soon as light begins to appear in the sky, it is called daytime. That's all we're going to do on Mishnah number 4. Mishnah number 5 on the a little further down the page. Although it is preferable to fulfill a particular day's mitzvah at the earliest possible hour, we need to say the Shema in the morning. Ideally, say it as early as possible. We need to do morning prayers. Ideally, say them as early as possible. We need to wash our hands as soon as we get out of bed. As soon as we get out of bed, right? So anything that we have to do in the morning, ideally, we do it as early as possible. So even though we should do it as early as possible, the fact is, legally speaking, Jewish law, the entire day is a valid time for reading the Megillah. We'd like to read the Megillah along with morning services, but you have the whole span of daytime to do the daytime reading of the Megillah. And likewise, the entire day is a valid time for reading the Megillah, for reciting Hallel, the Psalms 113 through 118 that we sing on festivals and on Rosh Chodesh and Hanukkah, and for sounding the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Good to do it early, but the daytime blowing of the shofar can happen all day long. Also for taking the lulav and the other species on Sukkot, for the additional prayer, the Musaf prayer, which is recited on Shabbos and other occasions, and for the additional offerings that were sacrificed in the temple on these occasions we've just named. And the entire day is also a valid time for the confession over the bulls brought by the Sanhedrin or by the high priest to atone for mistakes they had made in their instruction to the people. Right, we've covered this before, that if the Sanhedrin, the sages, the leaders of that generation, or the high priest made a mistake interpreting Jewish law, announced that to the people, and then actually led the people to make a transgression because they were told what to do, it's not the people's fault, but now everyone's done something wrong because the leadership made a mistake. They did it, it was a mistake, an honest mistake, but once they learn of it, they have to bring special bulls of atonement when the temple is standing as a sacrifice, and that needs to be done during the day. Also, the daytime and the entire day is the correct time for the declaration made on the last day of Passover in the 4th and 7th year of the Shemitah cycle, the sabbatical cycle, stating that one's obligations with regard to tithes have been properly fulfilled. See Deuteronomy 26, 12 through 15. And for the confession of sins made by the high priest on Yom Kippur over the special offerings brought on that day. The entire day is also a valid time for placing hands on the head of an offering, for slaughtering an offering, for waving those offerings that require waving in the temple when the holy temple is standing, for bringing meal offerings near to the altar, for scooping out a fistful of flour for the daily meal offering in order to burn it on the altar, and for burning the fistful of flour on the altar, for pinching the necks of the turtle doves and young pigeons sacrificed as offerings in the temple, and for receiving the blood of an offering in a vessel, and for sprinkling blood on the altar and this curtain separating between holy and the Holy of Holies. Also, the entire day is a valid time for giving a woman suspected by her husband of having been unfaithful. This is the ritual of the sota, and there's an entire tractate of the Talmud that we'll be studying later about the sota. But when she goes through, this ritual, and she would only have to go through it under very specific circumstances. But the Torah delineates when a woman is suspected of committing adultery, she says, no, I didn't, that there's a special ritual that they would do when the Holy Temple is standing. And that must be done during the daytime, and all day is available. and for breaking the neck of the heifer as part of the procedure followed when a corpse is found outside of a town and it is not known who caused his death. See Deuteronomy 21, 1 through 9. And for all the steps in the purification process of the mitzvah, one suffering from tzara'as. Correspondingly, all the mitzvahs that must be performed at night may be performed any time during the night. Same idea. If something that has to be done during the day, so you have all day to do it. Something that has to be done during the night, you have all night to do it. What does that include? The entire night is a valid time for reaping the omer of barley on the night following the first day of Passover, for burning the fats of offerings that had been brought during the preceding day, that's done at night, and for burning the limbs of burnt offerings. And this is the principle. Something that is a mitzvah, a commandment to perform during the day, is valid if performed any time during the entire day. And something that is a mitzvah to perform at night is valid if performed any time during the entire night. That was a longish Mishnah, but that was Mishnah number 5. Gemara. The Gemara asks, from where do we derive that these mitzvahs, these commandments, were commanded to be performed specifically during the day? How do we know that these things are supposed to be done during the day? With regard to reading the Megillah, the verse states that these days should be remembered and kept. For reciting the Hallel, the proof is from that which is written in the Hallel. From the rising of the sun to its setting, the Lord's name is to be praised, which is in Psalm 113, which is part of the Hallel. Rabbi Yosef said, actually the proof is from another verse in Hallel in Psalm 118. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad. And it says this is the day, so we do it during the day. And daytime is the time for taking the lulav on Sukkot, the palm branch. And you shall take for yourselves on the first day the fruit of a beautiful tree, branches of date palm, and boughs of dense leaf tree, and the willows of the brook. Those are the 4 species, the arba minim, that we take on Sukkot: the myrtle, the willow, the palm, and the fruit, the esrog. And we do that during the day. And so how do we know? Because it says, and you shall take for yourselves on the first day the fruit of. Daytime is also the time for sounding the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. How do we know? Numbers 29:1. It is a day of sounding the shofar to you, etc. That's how we know and derive that it has to happen during the day. We go to the end of chapter 2. We're on page 21a now. And the last little bit of chapter 2, the Mishnah concludes something that it is a mitzvah to perform at night may be performed the entire night. And the Gemara asks, what does this principle come to add that has not already been mentioned explicitly? Since they actually named all of the mitzvahs that are performed at night, why do we have a principle? Like you just said, all these things that are performed at night, it's valid if you do them anytime during the night. So why do we need a principle to tell us that? And the Gemara answers, this comes to include the eating of the Pesach, the Paschal offering at Passover, which was not mentioned. And consequently, this Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, as it is taught in a Baraisa that it is written, and they shall eat the meat on that night. Exodus 12:8. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, it is stated here on that night, and it is stated further on, and I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night. Well, just as there, right, when the 10th plague happened, when God passed through the land of Egypt and smote the firstborn of the Egyptians, so that finally Pharaoh would let the Jewish people leave Egypt, that happened at midnight, and it wasn't until midnight that happened. So too here, the Paschal offering may be eaten only until midnight. And the Mishnah, which asserts that the Paschal offering may be eaten all night, is therefore not in accordance with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. What is the law? The Passover offering, right, the Pesach, when the temple is standing, we no longer eat that at Passover, but when the Holy Temple is standing, then we bring a lamb or a goat, right, and we sacrifice that night with a group of people, and it has to be eaten that night, and anything that's left over gets burned. You can't eat it the next day. Can we eat that Passover offering all night long or only until midnight? And the law is All night long is okay by Torah. But the rabbinic enactment is you do have to finish it before midnight, which they actually did as a fence around the Torah to ensure that none of it would be left over and you were eating it during the day. That's just a nice fence around the Torah. Now, they could have said you have to finish by 3 in the morning, but they said by midnight, and we see that there's really in deference to Elazar ben Azariah and this idea that we should finish by midnight. So maybe that particular fence around the Torah was a little bit more restrictive. That concludes chapter 2 here in Tractate Megillah. Now we're in chapter 3 on page 21a. There are 4 chapters in this tractate. We're going to be finishing, with God's help, next week, and we'll make a siyum on Tractate Megillah. Chapter 3, Mishnah number 1. Now that we're talking about public reading of the Megillah, we're actually going to digress in this chapter and talk a little bit more about the general laws of reading scripture publicly, particularly Torah reading on Shabbos festivals and other times. Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 3. One who reads the Megillah may position himself as he wishes, either standing or sitting. Whether one person reads the Megillah or 2 people read it together, they have fulfilled their obligation. In a place where people are accustomed to recite a blessing over the reading, one should recite a blessing. And in a place where it is customary not to recite a blessing, one should not recite a blessing. And the Mishnah records several laws governing public Torah readings, right? Now that we talked about public Megillah readings, we're going to talk about public Torah reading. On Mondays and Thursdays, during the morning service, and on Shabbos during the afternoon service, 3 people read from the Torah. We have 3 Alios. One may neither decrease the number of readers nor add to them. And one does not conclude with a reading from the prophets, a haftarah, on those occasions, right? So on Mondays and Thursdays, when there's public readings of the Torah, and on Saturday afternoon by Mincha, there's 3 Alios. 3 people are called up to make a blessing over the 3 parts of that Torah reading. And one does not conclude with a reading from the haftarah from the prophets on those occasions. Both the one who begins the reading and the one who concludes the reading from the Torah recite a blessing. One recites before the beginning of the reading, and one recites after its conclusion, but the middle reader does not recite a blessing. That is not the law. Right? This is why we don't paskin from the Mishnah, and we don't paskin from the Gemara. Sometimes the sages will state something like that's the law, but for one reason or another, the law changed later in the discussion. And so you have to be careful. So absolutely, when we have Torah readers in synagogue, people are called up and they make a blessing before the reader reads that portion for them, and then a blessing afterward. Each of the 3 people who are called to the Torah make a blessing before and after that reading. On the days of the new moon, the beginnings of Hebrew months, Rosh Chodesh, and on the intermediate days of a festival, Passover, right? The first 2 days outside of Israel is full-fledged festival. The last 2 days, full-fledged festival. The intermediate days have a measure of holiness. So they're not regular days, but they're not as holy as the festival days. So we have special readings there of Torah readings on those days, the intermediate days and on Rosh Chodesh. And on those days, 4 people read from the Torah. And one may neither decrease the number of readers nor add to them. And one does not conclude with a reading from the prophets, with a haftarah. Both the one who begins the reading and the one who concludes the reading from the Torah recite a blessing. The first reader recites a blessing before and the last reader after, but the law changed later. The Mishnah formulates a general principle with regard to the number of people who read from the Torah on different occasions. And this is the principle. Any day on which there is an additional offering sacrificed in the temple, and that is not a festival, and what is that? That's Rosh Chodesh and the intermediate days of a festival, 4 people read from the Torah. On a festival, so the first 2 days of Passover, the last 2 days of Passover, or in Israel, the first day of Passover and the last day of Passover, the first day of Sukkot and the last day of Sukkot, Shavuos, which are festival days, 5 people read from the Torah. On Yom Kippur, 6 people read from the Torah. And on Shabbos, 7 people read from the Torah. And right there, we see the importance of Shabbos. right? That is the holiest day of the year. And it comes every week. It's amazing. But 7 people read on Shabbos. One may not decrease the number of readers, but one may add to them on those festival and Shabbos days. And one may not decrease the number of readers, but one may add to them. And on these days, one concludes with a reading from the prophets, Haftorah. Both the one who begins with the reading and the one who concludes the reading from the Torah recite a blessing. One recites before and one after its conclusion. The middle readers don't recite a blessing, but as we've said several times, that law was changed. Gemara. We learned in the Mishnah that one may read the Megillah while sitting. And it was taught in a Baraisa. This is not the case with regard to reading the Torah, as one must stand when reading the Torah. And the Gemara asked, from where are these matters derived? And Rabbi Abahu said, it is as the verse states, but as for you, stand here with me, and I will speak to you all the commandments and the statutes. This is God talking to Moses. But as for you, stand here with me. Meaning that God taught the Torah to Moses while Moses was standing, which indicates that the Torah must be received while standing. And Rabbi Bahu said, were the verse not written in this manner, it would be impossible to utter it in deference to God. The phrase, with me, indicates that, as it were, even the Holy One, blessed be He, was standing at the giving of the Torah. But, God is not anthropomorphic like us, right? God is everywhere. We're in God. So when God said, stand here with me, it doesn't mean, I'm standing and you're standing next to me, Moses. But, that's how it's written in the Torah. So that's how it's written in the Torah. And with regard to Torah study while standing, the sages taught from the days of Moses until the time of Rabban Gamliel, they would study the Torah only while standing, as learning from one's teacher is comparable to receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, during which the Jewish people stood. Right? So when God uttered the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai before the entire assemblage of the nation of Israel, all the people stood. And to this day, you go to a traditional Jewish school, a yeshiva, when a teacher walks in the room, all the students stand out of respect. Then they sit to continue learning. That form of respect for our elders, it would be nice if it was generalized throughout the culture, I would say. But when Rabban Gamliel died, weakness descended into the world, and they would study Torah while sitting. So they still stand when their elders walked in, but for the studying, it was done sitting. Before that, it was only done standing. And this is, as we learned in the Mishnah, when Rabban Gamliel died, honor for the Torah ceased, as standing while learning is an expression of honor, not just for the teacher, but for the Torah itself, and for God, therefore. And the Gemara points out an apparent contradiction with regard to this very issue. Now, we still do stand at times when the 10 Commandments are being read in synagogue, right? When we reach that point in our yearly cycle of Torah reading, yes, everybody stands for the reading of the 10 Commandments. When we finish a book of the Torah, everybody stands for that. And the Gemara points out an apparent contradiction with regard to this very issue. One verse says, and I sat va'eshev on the mount, Deuteronomy 9:9. And another verse says, and I stood on the mount, Deuteronomy 10:10. Did Moses sit or did he stand? And the Gemara cites several possible resolutions. Rav said Moses would stand and learn the Torah from God and then sit and review what he had learned. Rabbi Hanina said Moses was not standing or sitting, but rather he was bowing. Rabbi Yochanan said the term yeshiva is nothing more than an expression of remaining in one place, as it is stated, and you dwelled, vateshvu, in Kadesh for many days, Deuteronomy 146. And Rava said Moses studied easy material while standing and difficult material while sitting. Skip a few paragraphs. We're on the B side of page 21. We learn in the Mishnah, in a place where people are accustomed to recite a blessing over the reading, one should recite a blessing. And Abaye said they taught that the matter depends upon local custom only with regard to the blessing that is recited after the reading of the Megillah. But as for the blessing that is recited before the reading of the Megillah on Purim, it is a mitzvah. It is a commandment to recite the blessing according to all opinions. As Rabbi Yehuda said, that Shmuel said, with regard to all the mitzvahs, one recites a blessing over them prior to their performance, right? When we're going to study Torah, that's why we say a blessing over learning Torah every morning, because then we're going to study Torah after that. And that's why in morning prayers, we say the blessing, God, blessing God for commanding us to study Torah. And then right away, we study some Torah. We read the passage where God instructed Moses to teach Aaron how to bless the people. And then we read the priestly blessing. Skip a few more paragraphs. We learn in the Mishnah on Mondays and on Thursdays during the morning service and on Shabbos during the afternoon service, 3 people read from the Torah. And the Gemara asks, corresponding to what were these 3 readers instituted? And Rav Asi said they correspond to the 3 sections of the Bible. The Pentateuch, meaning the 5 books of the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, right? So the prophets is that section, Jeremiah, Isaiah, etc. And the writings, like Psalms, Proverbs, etc. And Rava said the three readers, right, the 3 Alios that we have on Mondays and Thursdays and Saturday afternoon correspond to the 3 components of the Jewish people, the Kohanim, the Leviim, and the Yisroelim, right? So, and that's why in a traditional synagogue, the first reading, if there's a Kohen present, the Aliyah will be given to a Kohen, the second Aliyah will be given to a Levi, and the third will be given to a Yisrael, somebody who's neither a Kohen nor a Levi. Skip some more paragraphs. We learned in the Mishnah that one may neither decrease the number of readers nor add to them on, when there's 3 or when there's 4. And the one who begins the reading and the one who concludes the reading from the Torah each recite a blessing. It is taught in a Baraisa, the one who begins in the reading recites a blessing before reading from the Torah, and the one who concludes the reading recites a blessing after the reading. And the Gemara comments, and now, right, so that was in the Mishnah. Now this is the sages of the Gemara talking. And now that all who read from the Torah recite blessings both before and after, so that law changed sometime after the Mishnah was codified, but before the Talmud was finalized. So this, saying a blessing before and after an Aliyah, that's been going on for at least 1,500 years, if not, 1,800 years, something like that. And now that all who read the Torah recite blessings both before and after the reading from the Torah, this is the reason that the sages instituted this policy. It is a decree due to both those who enter the synagogue in the middle of the reading and do not hear the first reader's initial blessing, and due to those who leave the synagogue early and do not hear the final reader's concluding blessing, lest they come to the erroneous conclusion that one blessing suffices, either the one before or the one after. Since some people come late and some people come early, whatever Aliyahs they hear, they should know that there's a blessing before and a blessing after. Now we're going to skip a big section because a discussion about how we divide a short Torah reading to make sure that each reader gets the minimum number of verses, and how it handles situations where the Torah readings are short and it's difficult to divide. We actually had that whole discussion in Tractate Tainus, which is about public fast days and Torah readings on those days. And so we don't really have to repeat it here, especially when we're covering a lot of material in one day. So now I'm near the bottom of 22a. We learned in the Mishnah there is a principle: any day on which there is an additional offering sacrificed in the temple, and that is not a festival, 4 people read from the Torah. When are there additional offerings, but it's not a festival? That's Rosh Chodesh and the intermediate days of the festivals, which are not full-fledged festival days. So does the Mishnah mean to say that only on the new moon and the intermediate days of a festival, when there is an additional offering, that's when 4 people read? But here on a public fast day, is that not a time when we can have 4 people read, when there's no additional offering? So therefore only 3 people read? Or perhaps here too, there is an additional prayer, as on a public fast days, we add the prayer, Anenu, hear our prayer, God. We're praying extra special because, for example, there's a drought and we're all fasting because the rain hasn't come. So on such a day, do we have a Torah reading and do we have 4 readers since there's an additional prayer that day, even though there's no additional offering? And the Gemara attempts to adduce a proof, and it's going to go on a long discussion about that. We skip to page 22b at the top, and the Gemara tries to adduce a proof about this question. Come and hear the following Baraisa. This is the general principle. Any day on which labor is permitted and prolonging the prayer service would constitute a deprivation of labor for the masses, for example, a public fast day and Tisha B'Av, right, when labor is permitted because it's not a festival, only 3 people read from the Torah. And that's why we don't do 4 readers like we would on the intermediate days of a festival or Rosh Chodesh when we do a Torah reading on a public fast day. But any day on which prolonging the prayer service would not constitute a deprivation of labor for the masses, for example, Rosh Chodesh, when it is customary for women to refrain from work. There is a tradition that on Rosh Chodesh, women take the day off, and that's rewarding them for not participating in the sin of the golden calf at Mount Sinai. And on the intermediate days of a festival, when one may not perform labor unless refraining from labor will cause him to lose money, right? Intermediate days of a festival, you can work, but you should try to avoid working. So then it's not such a burden on the community to have 4 readers instead of 3, and so we have 4 readers. Skip several paragraphs. The Gemara cited an incident involving Rav, and now it turns to examine the matter itself. Rav once happened to come to Babylonia on a public fast, and he stood and he read from a Torah scroll. And when he began to read, he recited a blessing. But when he concluded, he did not recite a blessing. Right now we've established, that the sages established, that anytime there's a Torah reader, he should say a blessing before and after. Why did Rav not do that during Talmudic times? So he didn't do that. He recited a blessing when he began to read, but when he concluded, he did not recite a blessing. Everyone else fell on their faces, i.e. bowed down on the floor during the Tachanan prayer. So this tells you that it was just regular daytime services, not Shabbos or a festival, because we don't do Tachanan on those days. But on regular weekday prayers, every morning we recite Tachanan, when we basically do a confession of our sins and ask God to forgive us and to hear our prayers, a sort of mini Yom Kippur that we do every morning, unless there's some kind of a festival or festivity, like if there's a bris or a wedding, a celebration like that, then we don't do Tachanan. But most days we do. In Chabad, there's a bunch of days where you don't do Tachanan because it's the yard site of one of the 7 Rebbes, for example. Or other prominent figures might cause there to not be Tachanan. But generally, there is Tachanan. So, on that day, there was Tachanan, but Rav did not fall on his face. He did not recite Tachanan by falling on his face. And the Gemara asks, what is the reason that Rav did not fall on his face? And the Gemara answers, it was a stone floor. And it was taught in a Baraisa with regard to the verse, nor shall you install any figured stone in your land to bow down upon it. Leviticus 26:1. Now the idea there is, don't have any kind of idol or anything that can even be mistaken for an idol, because idolatry is so, prohibited. It's the second commandment, right? You should have no graven images. After the second commandment, you'll have no gods before me. So anything that could even be misconstrued as an idol and the idea that you'd be bowing down to it might invoke this idea. And Rav didn't want to bow down on a stone floor because of this reason, right? Leviticus 26:1, that upon it, i.e. on any type of figured stone, you shall not bow down in your land, i.e. anywhere in your land other than in the temple. There is a stone floor in the temple. There you can bow down, right? Because there's God's presence is in the holy temple. Therefore, there shouldn't be a stone floor anywhere else that you might bow down on it. But you shall bow down upon the stones of the temple only. And this is in accordance with the opinion of Ula, As Ula said, the Torah prohibited bowing down only upon a stone floor. And the Gemara asks, if so, why was it specifically Rav who did not bow down? All of the other people present were also prohibited from bowing down on the stone floor. And the Gemara answers, the stone section of the floor was only in front of Rav, as the rest of the floor was not paved. They discuss that story a little bit more. We're going to skip forward. We still have much to cover. We're at the top of 23a. We learned in the Mishnah, on a festival, 5 people read. On Yom Kippur, 6 people read. And on Shabbos, 7 people read. And one may not decrease the number of readers, but one may add to them. And the Gemara asks, who is the Tana? Who is the sage of the Mishnah? It is not Rabbi Yishmael and not Rabbi Akiva, as it is taught in a Baraisa. On a festival, 5 people read from the Torah. And on Yom Kippur, 6 people read. And on Shabbos, 7 people read. One may not decrease or add to the required number of readers. One may not decrease nor add. That's the statement of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He says, on a festival, 5 people read from the Torah. On Yom Kippur, 7 people read. And on Shabbos, 6 people read. Now, the law obviously does not follow Rabbi Akiva, because we have 6 Alios on Yom Kippur and 7 on Shabbos. Rabbi Akiva also says one may not decrease these numbers, but one may add to them. Then they discuss that disagreement. The law is, as we've stated. And the Gemara asks, who is the Tana who taught that which is taught in a Baraisa on a festival? And why are these laws the way they are? On a festival, one is slow to arrive at synagogue because one is busy preparing the festive meal. You can cook on a festival, so you're late getting to synagogue because you're cooking the festive meal in the morning. So you're slow to arrive, but one is quick to leave in order to go eat the festive meal. On Yom Kippur, one is quick to arrive in the synagogue because he's not cooking in the morning, and he's slow to leave because the day of Yom Kippur is long, and you can't eat when you get home anyway. You're fasting all day, so no one's in a hurry to leave. And on Shabbos, right? So on Shabbos, one is quick to arrive because there's no cooking on Shabbos. So he arrives early, but he's also quick to leave because he wants to get home and have that beautiful Shabbos lunch. So let us say that it is Rabbi Akiva who holds that an additional man reads from the Torah on Yom Kippur, which prolongs the service on that day. That's why he maybe says that there's 7 readers on Yom Kippur. But the Gemara rejects this suggestion. Even if you say that it is Rabbi Yishmael who leaves the synagogue late because the order of the day, i.e. the prayer service, is very long on Yom Kippur, as it includes many supplications and confessions, that doesn't prove that the reason that they're leaving late is because there's no food to eat at home. And at any rate, we have 6 Alios on Yom Kippur and 7 on Shabbos. Skip some more paragraphs. The sages taught in a Tosefta, Megillah 3:11, all people count toward the quorum of 7 readers, even a minor and even a woman. However, the sages said that a woman should not read the Torah out of respect for the congregation. What is the law? All people count toward the quorum of 7 readers, including women. However, on days when fewer than 7 readers are called to the Torah, this is not the case. So you can't count other people when there's only 3 or 4 readers or 5 on a festival. But when there's 7, right? So then you could count, minors and women according to this law. But the sages said that a woman should not read the Torah in public out of deference to the congregation. There's no further explanation here. Now, this is one of the major differences between Orthodox Judaism, Hasidic Judaism, Haredi Judaism, traditional Judaism, and Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, these much newer streams of Judaism where, they take an egalitarian perspective and say that, that women should be allowed to read the Torah. And they do read the Torah in those synagogues, but they do not do that in the traditional places, as I've said. A dilemma was raised before the sages with regard to the reader who concludes the maftir Torah reading, the last Torah reading, and he reads from the prophets, the Haftorah. What is the law? Does he count toward the quorum of 7 readers? And Rav Huna and Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba disagreed about this matter. One said he counts, and one said he does not count. And the one who said that he counts toward the 7 readers holds that opinion because he reads from the Torah. And so if you're in a synagogue on Shabbos, so there's 7 aliyahs, then the reader, the actual appointed Torah reader, the Bal Korah, recites Kaddish, and then we do one more aliyah called the maftir. But the maftir is a repetition of just the last few verses of the 7th aliyah. And then the one who does the maftir says the blessings over the reading from the prophets, from the Haftorah. The reader and what is the halacha? The reader who concludes the Torah reading, does he count toward the quorum? The Gemara did not provide a final ruling with regard to this debate. Some hold that the reader who concludes the Torah reading and reads the Haftorah is included in the quorum, while others disagree. Some say that the issue remains unresolved. In practice, the custom is to call 7 readers to the Torah without the maftir. Kaddish is then recited, and then the maftir reads some verses that the previous reader already read, and then he reads the Haftorah. We move over to 23b, Mishnah number 2, here in chapter 3. One does not recite the introductory prayers and blessing, porisin, before Shema, nor does one pass before the ark to repeat the Amidah prayer, nor do the priests lift their hands to recite the priestly blessing, nor is the Torah read in public, nor does one conclude with a reading from the prophets in the presence of fewer than 10 men. Meaning, you need a minyan to do these things, to say the introductory prayers, and blessing before the Shema, to have a prayer leader who repeats the Amidah publicly, to have the Kohanim lift their hands and bless the congregation, to have a public reading of the Torah, and to read a Haftorah. All of that requires a minyan. And one does not observe the practice of standing up and sitting down for the delivery of eulogies at a funeral service, nor does one recite the mourner's blessing or comfort mourners in 2 lines after the funeral, or recite the bridegroom's blessing, and one does not invite others to recite the grace after meals. I conduct a zimun with the name of God. So this is other practices that require a minyan, with fewer than 10 men present. Do we say Birkan Hamazon? Do we sing and have a zimun where we can come, gentlemen, let us bless, and then recite the grace after the meals? Do we do that with less than 10? Yes, we do. But when we have a minyan present, then we add Elokeinu, right, which we pronounce the proper way. We add God's name into the grace after meals in a particular way, and that requires a minyan. And similarly, if one consecrated land and now wishes to redeem it, the land must be assessed by 9 men and 1 priest for a total of 10. And similarly, assessing the value of a person who has pledged his own value to the temple must be undertaken by 10 people, one of whom must be a priest. That's Mishnah number 2. Gemara. The Gemara asks, from where are these matters, i.e. that 10 people are needed in each of these cases? Where is this derived? Rabbi Chiya bar Abba said that Rabbi Yochanan said, it is as the verse states, and I shall be hallowed among the people of Israel. Among the children of Israel. Leviticus 22:32, which indicates that any expression of sanctity may not be recited in a quorum of fewer than 10 men. And from where in the verse may this be inferred? Okay, so God said, I will be hallowed among the children of Israel. So how do we know that's 10? Rabbi Chiya taught, it is inferred by means of a gezerah shava, linking 2 words in 2 different parts of the Torah. And the words are toch and toch, among. Here it is written, and I shall be hallowed among the children of Israel. And there, with regard to Korach's congregation, when Korach leads that rebellion against Moses in the wilderness, it is written in Numbers 16:21, separate yourselves from among this congregation. So there's a link among, right? I shall be hallowed among the children of Israel, and separate yourselves from among the followers of Korach, that congregation. Okay, so now we're linking I will be hallowed among to don't stand among Korach's people. How do we get that it's 10? Well, the connotation of 10 associated with the word among in the portion of Korach is in turn inferred by means of another verbal analogy between the word congregation, edah, written there, and the word edah, written in reference to the 10 spies. 12 spies were sent into the land of Israel, one from each tribe. 2 of them maintained faith in God and his servant Moses. Those were Joshua and Caleb. The other 10 freaked out all the people and said, yeah, the land is beautiful, but it's occupied by giants. We're going to be beat up if we try to enter there. All is lost. And God became so angry with that report and the panic that it ensued. God said, okay, all you people who came out of Egypt, you're not worthy to enter the promised land. This generation will die off and your children will enter the promised land. And that was all in the incident of the spies. How many committed that sin? 10 of the 12. Right? So congregation. It is written here, how long shall I bear with this evil congregation? Consequently, just as there in the case of the spies, it was written a congregation of 10 people, as there were 12 spies altogether. Joshua and Caleb were not included in the evil congregation. And so too here in the case of Korach, the reference is to a congregation of 10 people. The first several items mentioned in the Mishna are expressions of sanctity, and they consequently require a quorum of 10. Skip several paragraphs. We learn in the Mishnah, and similarly, assessing the value of a person who has pledged his own value to the temple must be undertaken by 10 people, one of whom must be a priest. The Gemara asks, can a person become consecrated and thereby require redemption? And Rabbi Abahu said, the Mishnah is referring to one who says, my assessment is incumbent upon me, and thereby pledges to donate a sum of money to the Holy Temple, equivalent to his own monetary value. And what is his own? What is a person's monetary value? As it is taught in a Baraisa, with regard to one who says, my assessment is incumbent upon me, the court assesses him as though he were a slave in order to determine the amount he is obligated to donate to the temple treasury. And a slave is compared to land, as it is written with regard to slaves, and you shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you to inherit them for a possession. Leviticus 25:46. Consequently, the same criteria apply. Assessing land that is consecrated, assessing a person who consecrates his own value. That requires a quorum of 10, one of whom must be a priest. Mishnah number 3. One who reads from the Torah in the synagogue should not read fewer than 3 verses. And when it is being translated, he should not read to the translator more than 1 verse at a time, so that the translator will not become confused. And with regard to the prophets, one may read to the translator 3 verses at a time. With respect to the Torah, an incorrect translation might lead to an error in practice, but this concern does not apply to the prophets, since it's not, we don't get laws from the prophets, we get inspiration. If the 3 verses constitute 3 separate paragraphs, that is to say, if each verse is a paragraph in itself, one must read them to the translator one by one. One may skip from one place to another while reading the prophets, but one may not skip from one place to another while reading the Torah. How far may he skip? As far as he can, provided that the translator will not conclude his translation while the reader is still rolling the scroll to the new location. The reader may not cause the congregation to wait for him after the translator is finished, as that would be disrespectful to the congregation. We're on 24a, Mishnah number 4. The one who concludes with a reading from the prophets from the Haftorah is also the one who is honored to recite the introductory prayers and blessing before the Shema, and he passes before the ark to repeat the Amidah prayer. That's a little confusing because the blessings of the Shema and the repetition of the morning Amidah all happen before the Torah service on Shabbos. So the one who is going to say do the Maftir and the blessings of the Haftorah how could he then do the blessings of the Shema? And what they're saying is the one who is given that honor is one who is typically also given the honor of leading the morning prayers and the repetition of the Amidah. And if the one who reads the Haftorah is a minor, who may read the Haftorah but is not qualified to lead the congregation in prayer, so his father or teacher is honored to pass before the ark in his place. A minor may read the Torah in public and also translate the text for the congregation into Aramaic, but he may not recite the introductory prayers and blessing before Shema, and he may not pass before the ark to lead the congregation in prayer, and he may not lift his hands to recite the priestly benediction. Have you ever been in a synagogue when they're doing the Kohanic blessing and children go up there, children who are Kohanim? They can do that, but they can't be the only ones. They can accompany their dad, who's a Kohen, and blessing the congregation so that they can learn how to do the blessing. But you can't only receive the Kohanic blessing from a minor. One whose limbs are exposed, pochea, may recite the introductory prayers and the blessing before Shema and translate the Torah into Aramaic, but he may not read from the Torah out of respect for the Torah. You shouldn't have short sleeves if you're the Torah reader. He may not pass before the ark to lead the congregation in prayer, and he may not lift his hands to recite the Kohanic blessing. One who is blind may recite the introductory prayers and the blessing before the Shema, and he may also translate the Torah reading into Aramaic. Rabbi Yehuda says, anyone who has not seen the luminaries, i.e. the sun, the moon, and the stars, in all of his life, i.e. he was blind from birth, may not recite the introductory prayers and the blessing before the Shema. Why? Because the first of the blessings before the Shema is the blessing over the luminaries, and one who has never seen them cannot recite the blessing at all. That's the Mishnah. Gemara. The Gemara asks, what is the reason that the one who reads the Haftorah is honored with these other roles? And Rav Papa said it is due to desire to grant him honor. And Rabbi Bar Shimi said a different reason. It is due to a concern that they will come to quarrel, as the individual who read the Haftorah will quarrel with the individual who is honored to lead the congregation in prayer. We skip over to 24b. The Mishnah continues, one who is blind may recite the introductory prayers and blessing before Shema, and he may also translate the Torah reading into Aramaic. And Rabbi Yehuda says, anyone who has not seen the luminaries in his life may not recite the first of the blessings of the Shema, which is the blessing over the luminaries. And it's taught in Baraisa that they said to Rabbi Yehuda, well, many have seen enough with their mind to expound upon the Divine Chariot, meaning mysticism, and the Divine Chariot is so-called, is the sort of Jewish mysticism derived from the vision of Ezekiel. But the idea here is, well, wait a minute. You're saying that a blind person can't lead the congregation in reciting the blessing of the luminaries because he's never seen the luminaries. But we have, like sages and rabbis and regular people who've never seen the vision of Ezekiel, and yet they can expound on it. They can learn and teach Jewish mysticism, even though they themselves have never seen those visions. So why are you saying, Rabbi Yehuda, that a blind person who maybe imagined what the sun and the stars and the moon look like in his mind, isn't that enough for him to make that blessing? And how does Rabbi Yehuda answer this argument? He can say that there, with regard to the Divine Chariot, Merkava mysticism, the matter depends upon the heart's comprehension. And one can concentrate his mind and understand the chariot, even if he has never actually seen it. But here, with regard to the luminaries, the blessing is recited due to the benefit that one actually derives from them. That they light up the world for you. And a blind person doesn't see that. And one who is blind does not derive any benefit from them, and therefore he may not recite the blessing over them on behalf of the congregation. And the rabbis maintain, that's wrong, Rabbi Yehuda, because even a blind man derives benefit from the luminaries, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. As it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yosef said, all my life I was troubled by this verse, which I did not understand, and you shall grope at noon as the blind man gropes in the darkness. And I was perplexed What does it matter to a blind person whether it is dark or light? He cannot see in any event, so why does the verse speak about a blind man in the darkness? And I continued to ponder the matter until the following incident occurred to me. I was once walking in the absolute darkness of the night, and I saw a blind man who was walking on his way with a torch in his hands. And I said to him, "My son, why do you need this torch if you are blind?" And he said to me, "As long as I have a torch in my hand, people see me, and they save me from the pits and the thorns and the thistles. Even a blind man derives at least indirect benefit from the light, and therefore he may recite the blessing over the heavenly luminaries." Now you might say, well, they also derive warmth from the sun, etc. But I guess here it's the luminaries, not blessing the sun for giving warmth, but blessing the sun, the moon, and the stars for giving light. But nevertheless, everyone derives benefit from it, including blind people. And in fact, Rabbi Yehuda is wrong, and the law is that a blind person can lead those prayers. Mishnah number 5. And I am almost done. So if you have questions or comments, get them in. It's been a long class. Mishnah number 5. A priest who has blemishes on his hands may not lift his hands to recite the priestly benediction. Because of his blemish, people will look at his hands, and it is prohibited to look at the hands of the priests during the priestly benediction. And Rabbi Yehuda says, even one whose hands were colored with satis, a blue dye, may not lift his hands to recite the priestly benediction, because the congregation will look at him. When the Kohanim are reciting a blessing in front of the congregation, we cover ourselves with our prayer shawls, and we don't look at them, and they cover themselves with a prayer shawl, and they don't look at us. They actually have their hands extended, but their prayer shawl is over their hands. We hear the benediction. We don't view the priest while they're doing it. Mishnah number 6. Right, the Mishnahs are coming hard and fast now. We're near the bottom of 24b. One who says, "I will not pass before the ark to lead the prayer service in colored garments," may not pass before the ark to lead the prayer service even in white garments. Why? There is a concern that one who insists on wearing clothing of a specific color during his prayers is actually a heretic, and therefore he's unfit to lead the service. Because the sages never had this law that the prayer leader has to wear white or can't wear colors. Like you can wear, there's no color requirement. If the prayer leader has some kind of a color requirement for himself, he's following some alternative code of law, and therefore we don't let him lead the prayers. If he says, "I will not lead the congregation wearing sandals," then he may not lead the congregation even barefoot, as he is not acting in accordance with the teachings of the sages. One who constructs his tefillin in a round shape exposes himself to danger during times of persecution, and yet he does not fulfill the mitzvah to don tefillin, as tefillin must be square. In other words, if you're wearing tefillin, which doesn't fulfill the requirements of tefillin, well, if the Romans are persecuting the Jews and they see you wearing that, they're going to, butcher you or execute you or persecute you like any other Jew. But you're actually not getting any benefit from that tefillin because it's not, kosher tefillin. If one placed a tefillin that's worn on the head, on his forehead, but not in its proper place above his hairline, or if he placed a tefillin that's worn on the arm in his palm rather than on his bicep, this is the way of heretics, i.e. those who reject the traditions of the sages with regard to the proper placement of the tefillin. If one plated his tefillin with gold, or placed a tefillin worn on the arm on the outside of the sleeve, this is the way of the outsiders, i.e. those who do not take part of the traditions of the Jewish people. And that's the end of what we're covering today. We did pages 20 through 24, 5 dafs in this marathon catch-up session. Whew. By the way, I'll just mention that we number the episodes of AT Daily, and we realized last week that somewhere along the line that we skipped a week, like the numbering was off. And that's why the numbers today, this counts as episodes 728 through 732, and now the numbering is correct. Somewhere along the line, we'll get the numbers back on track retroactively. But page 24 of Tractate Megillah is the 732nd day of the 7.5-year Daf Yomi cycle, which has 2,711 days in it. And that indicates to us that we just passed day 730 2 days ago, or yesterday actually. But January 5th is its 2-year anniversary. Now, solar year anniversary is not that meaningful in the Daf Yomi cycle, which really tracks just how many days of Talmud pages we're reading in that cycle. But nevertheless, we started January 5th, 2020. Here we are, one day after January 5th, 2022. There was a leap year in there, and that's why it came out that today is the 732nd page of the cycle. Okay, let's see if you have comments or questions. Oh, you signed into another account. Go. Okay. Nina's telling me there was a long discussion in the comments about deaf people. And Heather Dyke said that it feels discriminatory for a deaf person's Megillah reading not to be valid. Now, that is not to say that a deaf person, that somehow it's invalid for their own reading. Of course they can read the Megillah. What they're saying is, since they can't hear it read, they are not technically fulfilling the obligation to hear the Megillah, and therefore, even if they can articulate it well, the sages ruled. Now, also, that this may have changed. I don't know, if there's any kind of modern teshuva on this. Because in the sages' time, it was very difficult to be a deaf person, especially a deaf mute. They didn't have sign language. There was just a lot of difficulties that, thank God, we live in modern times, when people with various disabilities are so much more, able to enjoy all that everyone enjoys in life. Bill, thinking of deaf persons and the fact that sign language wasn't a thing that the sages would have had to reckon with, suppose the following. A deaf person reads from the Megillah by signing it to a group of other deaf persons. Granting that as they are deaf, they are strictly speaking not obligated in hearing the Megillah as such, would this be an otherwise licit and satisfactory reading of the Megillah for the deaf? I think so. I'm just not sure what the halacha is on this. What about a hearing person who knows sign and cannot otherwise find the Megillah reading? Would it qualify as a foreign language that one knows? Now, that's a great point, right? Because we've seen that it can be read in your own language. It doesn't have to be read in Hebrew, and it can be a valid reading. So a person, right, who can't find another kind of, supposedly a person who's a regularly able person for hearing and speaking could read the Megillah for himself. But let's say he can't, right? Let's say that it's written in Hebrew and he's not familiar with Hebrew. But then there's a deaf person who's familiar with Hebrew, right, and can sign it into American Sign Language. And then this hearing person understands American Sign Language. I think that would count. It ought to count. I think it should count. I'm not sure if it counts. That's a great point, Phil. Sharon, regarding hearing, I encourage others to look at materials from the Jewish Deaf Alliance. I bet they've addressed this question. I don't know about Megillah, but for shofar, a number of ways have been devised to perceive the vibration of air caused by the shofar. What I have done with students is one method they recommend. If one holds a balloon with the two hands during the sounding of the shofar, you can perceive the vibrations with the hands, and this is considered comparable to hearing. It is interesting to note that in sign language, Shema, hear, is signed not as hearing or listening, but listen and pay attention. Beautiful. Thank you, Sharon. Christo, My rabbi is deaf. Often, I use American Sign Language as I speak to my rabbi, even though she now has a cochlear implant, as my signing helps her understand me. I even use ASL in the service when I lead for a deaf couple that attends, and I give them a copy of my sermon so they're not left out. Yasher koach, Christo. That's amazing. Well done. Yosef, question. From where do we paskin nowadays? How do we know to maintain the opinions of the sages and which we do not for our days? And the answer is the Shulchan Aruch, right? So that has been compiled according to, in other words, Yosef Karo, who compiled the Shulchan Aruch, and the Alter Rebbe, who compiled another version of the Shulchan Aruch, and I forget who compiled the Ashkenaz version. His name escapes me right now. But basically, great modern sages, and by modern I mean 500 years ago, and 400 years ago, and 300 years ago, sort of went through, and the Rambam started it first about 1,000 years ago, Maimonides. They went through systematically and said, well, where did all these debates end up? And where, have the customs taken us? And, what is normative Jewish law in the Jewish world? And they compiled that, and that's how we know what Jewish law is. Now, there's questions that come up that aren't answered in the Shulchan Aruch because they didn't exist 500 years ago. And so there, we sort of recognized halakhic authorities, and then it gets established. But that's why, you want, this is one volume of a 5-volume set, which is the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, meaning this is a little Shulchan Aruch, right? So it's 5 volumes like this on Jewish law. Generally, they're going to take the sources all come from the Talmud, from the Mishna, but because, a law might be established in one volume of the Talmud and then it contradicts something somewhere else, or there was a question that came up later after the Gemara was closed, eventually they sort of settled what Jewish law exactly is, and we don't innovate on that. We just answer questions that haven't been answered before. But, it's a huge body of Jewish law, and it was set. But that's why we're careful that when we're reading the Gemara and it seems like, and the law is, maybe that's what the law is. Maybe we have to check, right? That's what's so good about the Koren Talmud. I love the Art Scroll. It has more extensive commentary from different sources than the Koren does. The Koren mostly features the commentary of Rav Steinsaltz, although there are definitely other sources mentioned in the margins. But whenever one of these questions of halacha comes up in the Koren Talmud, there are notes like here, halacha. Can you see that? And there are notes like there in the margin, halacha, right? And then the law on this particular question is, and then he'll say, how do we know that? Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim, and based on the comments of the Rima, or the Rambam in Sefer Achava. When did that law get established, and where are sources that we can look for further, proof on those questions? And finally, Sharon, is there a limit to how many Alios one can add so as not to burden the community? It's so rare that on Shabbos there's more than 7, except when Simchas Torah, right? So then everybody who's present gets an aliyah, so that everyone gets a chance to say a blessing over a Torah reading on Simchas Torah. And then there's lots and lots of aliyahs and multiple Torahs going if you have a synagogue that has multiple Torahs. On any Shabbos, there can be aliyahs added, but it's super rare. Super, super rare, and there would have to be a reason for it if it's not Simchas Torah, but it's possible. Where is that limit set? I'm not sure, but you put your finger on it. We don't want to burden the congregation that they should have to stay long and not get home to Shabbos lunch. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. If you're still here, you did great. Yasher koach, may you be strengthened to learn many more pages of Talmud with the discipline and enthusiasm that you learned today when we had a long session of learning, 80 minutes we have been together. I believe we're still one day behind. We should have reached page 25. I was going to do 25, but it's already been long. So I'm going to try to do that double tomorrow, 25 and 26, so that we're actually back on the Daf Yomi schedule with everyone else in the world. It'll be a lot easier tomorrow to do 2 than it was today to do 5. Tomorrow's Friday, our regular Friday time, noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. Have a good night.